Okay, so we just got to the point in Act 1 when Krogstad comes in. And we don't, I mean, Nora does not know him. Like, it's not like they've been bestie friends, or it's not Dr. Rank who has known both of, the whole couple, but Krogstad works for, um, and it's funny because it says when the servant comes in to introduce him, he says there's a gentleman to see the master, and as the doctor is with him. So he's come to talk to Torvald, not Nora. And then he says, it is I, Miss. Oh, there's Tate. Oh my goodness, we don't. Yay, Tate. Nice to see you. Hopefully you can hear just fine, Tate. But when he comes in, he says, it is I, Mrs. Helmer. So he came supposedly to see Torvald, and yet he knows Mrs. Helmer, and we find out through this scene, he knows Mrs. Helmer in a way that her husband doesn't know he knows her. And so this goes along with that deception. So we already have several lies that she's done. She lied about just the little cookie things. Remember, her husband doesn't like her getting macaroons and spending stuff on sweets. And we know she was eating them and yet totally denied it like 4 times to him. So, and then we find out that she took out a loan, and essentially she took it out illegally because women at this point cannot borrow money. But she took it out so that she could take her husband to Italy so he could get treatment and survive his illness, which he did. But without it, the doctor said he was going to die. And so she saved his life, but she did so through deceit. And he still doesn't, years later, he still doesn't know anything about it. And so Krogstad comes in and he says, it is I, Mrs. Helmer. And then Mrs. Lind, Christine, the person who just came to visit her, this old like high school friend or whatever, starts trembling, and she turns to the window, and you're like, why is she acting so weird? So Nora doesn't. We don't know why Nora would know Krogstad, but we certainly don't know why Mrs. Lind would know Krogstad. Okay. And then Nora's freaking out too. She says, she's speaking in a strained, low voice. She goes, well, what is it? What do you want to see my husband about? And Krogstad says, well, bank business in a way. I have a small post at the bank. In other words, he has a job. And I hear that our husband is to be our chief now. So her husband is getting promoted, like he's becoming like the general manager of the bank. And so, and then Nora says that and Krogstad says it's nothing but dry business matters. Absolutely nothing else. And she says, well, okay, go ahead and go into the study, but it's very awkward. And then she bows to him a little and shuts the door and then comes back. And Mrs. Lind says, who was that man? And Nora says, oh, he was a lawyer of the name of Krogstad. And Mrs. Lind said, then it really was he. So how does Mrs. Lind know him? Or do we don't find this out yet. I don't want to spoil all that because I kind of want to go through it play by play. But the truth is in a play, everything matters. So every piece of dialogue matters. Everything that people do matters. And the best playwrights don't waste time. So I don't know if you've ever read a story, and I don't think we really have in our list of stories where people just, like, hey, how are you? Oh, I'm good. How are you? Just the pleasantries. Nice day it is today. Oh, yeah, it's really great. Because that dialogue doesn't move forward. Like, it doesn't take us anywhere. It's just what people say all the time. It's kind of like if you watch shows where people answer the phone a lot, they almost never say hello and goodbye. They just say, hey, and oh, da 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 da. Okay, yeah, I'll see you there. And they don't say bye. In real life, we say bye all the time. And we say hello, even if we know who the person is, we'll be like, hello, so and so, because I know your name, But that's not what they do, and because they're shortening everything. So everything has to, this is tight. It's not like, old theater, like if you go back to the ancient Greeks, theater was essentially, it followed what they call the 3 unities. And so there were, in the unities, and I'll just type this in, were place, time, and action. And so unity of place meant that it uses the same set. It's always in the same place. Unity of time, so they're not switching, like movies can switch for, especially think about Mission Impossible, and they're going to all different remote parts of the world. Well, that doesn't happen in a Greek play. They're always in the same place. And the other one is time. And so essentially for the Greeks, ideally, everything would happen in exactly the same amount of time that it takes the play to happen. So you can't do like, here's a scene and then 5 years later. That was not Greek. No, no, no. The unity of time insists that at the very least, Greek theater, if a play could not cover more than the action that could happen in a day. So you can't have, 6 years later or 14 years later or even 5 months later. No, it had to be abbreviated into one day. And so in some ways, all the things already had to be set in motion for it to happen that fast. Then action pretty much dictated that only one plot is happening at the same time. Well, it's funny that we do have a couple of examples of real time where everything does happen in a certain amount of time. So for instance, probably the best example is the show 24. I don't know if any of you ever watched it. It hasn't been on for several years now, but my husband was a huge fan. So, but in 24's, I guess, premise is that it's if you look up Jack Bauer, that he was the main character, and he was I can't remember who played him. Good actor. He really did a good job. He was in the Designated Survivor, that show, later on. But essentially, everything that happened for the whole season happened in 24 episodes, and each episode was a live hour. That's what it's supposed to be. So, but what you realize is, first of all, I mean, like several of the seasons happened in LA. And so he would literally be on the freeway driving somewhere. And if you really have ever driven in LA, it takes you an hour to get anywhere, to go to the grocery store, because traffic is horrible. And yet he would drive somewhere and, oh, be right there. And he'd be there in 3 minutes. We'd have the commercial break and then he'd be there. And that just never happened. That's unrealistic. He once flew in a helicopter and he went all the way into Mexico, and that took like 10 minutes of an episode. So they play around with time. They speed it up when it really couldn't possibly happen that fast. But the attempt is to show it live, like it's really happening in real time. And that was kind of what the Greeks liked. In this case, though, even though this is a play in 3 acts, it's really a play in 3 days. So each act is a single piece. Like there aren't multiple scenes in these acts. They're all, you remember that with Trifles, essentially we only have like a 15-minute play. And so all of the action happens in that short visit to Mr. and Mrs. Wright's house when they're looking for clues and they're investigating upstairs and things like that. And they're talking about what happened. And so it can happen in 15 minutes. And so any scene in a play should happen in real time. And so anything that's essentially what Ibsen has done in this first act is he's had all these different characters coming and visiting. She comes home from shopping very quickly afterwards. Her husband comes out of his office. Very quickly after that, Mrs. Lind Christine comes to visit. And very quickly, really at the same time, Dr. Rank comes in. And then it couldn't be 10 minutes after Mrs. Lind and Nora have been talking that Krogstad comes in. So typically, I mean, we don't visit each other the same way. Okay, so there's a war movie called 1917. Well, yeah, there might be some. That's an interest. I would look forward if you can find a link to that movie, Tate. That would be a cool link to have. You can just post it in the chat if you want to. It'll actually pop up as a link, and it should be active even to people watching the video, because I enable the chat so people can read the chat while they're watching the video. Okay, so yeah, if you can find a link to it, even if it's like, watch with commercials or something, or tell us where we could find it, like if it's on Hulu or something, that would be awesome. Because then other people who have different subscriptions might be able to find it. I would be very interested in seeing that movie. So Krogstad comes in, and it's the truth is this is the act of rising action. So more and more complications are showing up. So at first we think here's the story just about the, a wife and her husband and how he calls her a squirrel all the time and kind of belittles her and treats her like a child. But no, it's more than that. Then we find out she's not a spendthrift. She's actually paying back a loan that she took to save her husband's life, and he doesn't know it. And so she's really, she's hiding a level of heroism, but it's because she's hiding what she thinks is a bad thing, that she took out a loan illegally. And if he knew any good reason she might have had for doing what she did, he will negate, because he'll be so angry that she took out a loan. And so she really is taking to heart all of these morality clauses that he's created. You never are in debt. You never do this. Don't spend too much money. Don't, and so she's judging herself on this. And then we do find out, though, she tells Christine that she actually did take out the loan. And then here comes Krogstad. Now, Christine knows him. Nora knows him, but not for the reason you might think. So we're going to actually talk a little bit about, everything that we find out about these characters in a play is either by what they say, what they do, or what other people say about them. So even the view, we were probably at first a little bit swayed by the view that Torvald has towards his wife, and we saw her as a spendthrift. Well, wow, she likes to spend money, and when she asks for money, we'd go, wow, she's asking for money. And so we are slowly going to change our view of her as we find out more about her. Some of it she says herself, but some of it is how other people see her. And it looks like Addie came in. Yay! Okay, got Mark. Thank you. So here comes Krogstad. He goes into the office to go talk to her husband, but she's stressed about it. Nora is, and we'll find out why. But she does manage to talk to Christine. Christine's kind of upset. And she goes, I used to know him. At one time, he was a solicitor's clerk in our town. And Nora says, yes, he was. So where they came from. And Mrs. Lynde says he is greatly altered. So he looks a lot different. Remember, Mrs. Lynde, that's what Nora said about her, that she looks very, very different. And Nora almost didn't recognize her. And then Nora says, well, he made a very unhappy marriage. And then she said, but he's a widower. So his wife has died, and he has a bunch of kids. And he's now has to raise them by himself. And Mrs. Lynde says, well, they say he carries on various kinds of businesses. And she goes, really? Perhaps he does. And then she lies. She goes, I don't know anything about it. Now, we don't know that she's lying, but remember, she's already lied about 52 other things. But now she's adding another lie, and she's lying to Christine. Remember that loan she took out? We're going to find out later that she took it out. She actually got the loan from Krogstad. And then she says, but don't let us think of business. It's so tiresome. So she's trying to change the subject. And then here comes Dr. Rank. And he already saw her husband. He already met with Torvald. Now he wants to come and talk to Nora. And so they she introduces them to each other because he doesn't know Christine. And Mrs. Lynde says that she goes upstairs slowly because she can't manage the stairs well. And it's because she's exhausted. So she's been living a rough life for Mrs. Lynde. She's been overworking herself. She says that. And Rank says, well, no more than that. Then he says, I suppose you've come to town to amuse yourself? And she goes, nope, I've come to look for work. And he says, is that a good cure for overwork? And she says, one must live, Dr. Rank. And he says that he sounds depressed. He goes, the general opinion seems to be that it's necessary to live. And Nora says, oh, you want to live. Well, we don't know the real stuff. He says, certainly, however wretched I may feel, I want to prolong the agony as long as possible. All my patients are like that. And so are those who are morally diseased. One of them, in a bad case too, is at this very moment with Helmer. And he mentions Krogstad. Remember, we already said he's a widower. So we're finding out stuff about Krogstad that we didn't know. And now he says, he calls him morally diseased. And Mrs. Lynde says, huh? Like she's upset because she liked Krogstad when she knew him before. And Nora's like, whom do you mean? And Rank says, it's Krogstad, a fellow you don't know at all. Now Nora knows him. He suffers from a diseased moral character, Mrs. Helmer. But even he began talking of its being highly important that he should live. So he's morally diseased, and yet he wants to live. And Nora says, well, what did he want to speak to Torvald about? And Rank says, I don't know. I only heard it was something about the bank. Okay, Showtime. Oh, Amazon Prime. Okay. I'll have to look. Thanks. So it was 1917. I'm going to write that down. The movie. Okay, so and so Dr. Rank says, oh, I only heard that it was something about the bank. And Nora said, I didn't know this. What's his name? Of course, she's lying because she knows him. Krogstad had anything to do with the bank. So she knows him. But she knows him because she took out a loan with him. She doesn't know he works for her husband, which is a bad thing. So this is raising the stakes a bit. And then Rank says he has some sort of appointment there. So in other words, he has a job at the bank. He says, I don't know whether you'll also find also in your part of the world that there are certain people who go zealously snuffing about to smell out moral corruption. And as soon as they have found some, put the person concerned into some lucrative position where they can keep an eye on him. Healthy natures are left out in the cold. In other words, if someone is morally reprehensible, they're more likely to get somewhere so that people keep an eye on them. And then Mrs. Lynde says, she actually takes up for Krogstad here. She goes, I still think the sick are those who most need taking care of. And he says, yes, there you are. That is the sentiment that is turning society into a sick house. So he's not sentimental, and he's not, really thinking about, people. And he is a doctor. And Nora breaks into smothered laughter and claps her hands. So she's a little nervous. And she says, I'm laughing at something quite different, something extremely amusing. She goes, tell me, Dr. Rank, are all the people who are employed in the bank dependent on Torvald now? Because he's the bank director. And he says, is that what you find so extremely amusing? And she says, that is my affair. So she won't tell him. It's perfectly glorious to think that Torvald has so much power over so many people. And so she's worried about Krogstad. And if he has power over Krogstad, that will make it easier for her to not get in trouble with her loan. And then she says, Dr. Rank essentially asked him if he wants a macaroon. He says, I thought they were forbidden. And then Nora lies. She says, yes, but these are some Christine gave me. And Christine tries to tell the truth. What? And then she goes, no, you know that Torvald couldn't know that Torvald had forbidden them. So she throws Christine under the bus, even though, Christine doesn't really get in trouble. And she says, I must tell you that he's afraid they will spoil my teeth. And she puts a macaroon into his mouth. You must have one too, Christine, and I shall have one, just a little one, or at most two. So she really loves macaroons, and she's just using these as excuses. But these are still lies. She's covering up over and over again. She says, there is just one thing in the world now that I should dearly love to do. And Rank says, well, what is it? And she goes, it's something I would dearly love to say if Torvald could hear me. And he says, well, why can't you say it? She goes, it's so shocking. And Rank says, well, I should not advise you to say it. Still, with us, you might. What is it you would like to say to Torvald? Torvald said, I would just love to say, I'm damned. And Rank says, are you mad? Because the idea of her saying that swear word that just wasn't done. And even Mrs. Lynde's concerned, Nora, dear. Rank's kind of grateful that Helmer's coming. He's like, say that here he is. Hush, hush, shh, shh. And she hides the packet of macaroons because Torvald is coming in. And he looks like he's going to leave. His coat's over his arm and his hat's in his hand. And she says, have you gotten rid of him? And Helmer says, yes, he has just gone. And she goes, let me introduce you to Christine. And she says, Mrs. Lynde, dear, Christine Lynde. He goes, of course, you were a school friend of my wife's. And Nora says, just think, she has taken a long journey in order to see you. And Torvald is, what? What do you mean? And Mrs. Lynde is like, no, really. And she says, Christine is tremendously clever at bookkeeping, and she's frightfully anxious to work under some clever man so as to perfect herself. So she's totally trying to butter up her husband. And Helmer is buttered up. He says, very sensible, Mrs. Lynde. And when she heard that you'd been appointed manager of the bank, she traveled here as quick as she could. Do you think we could get her a job? And Helmer says, it's not altogether impossible. I presume you are a widow. And why would he ask that? Is she a widow? Of course, we'd never be allowed to ask that today, ever. Why would he ask that of her at this time? This is the 1870s. Right. Why would she need a job if she had a husband who worked? And it's also, it was very much looked down upon for women to work when their husbands were alive. Like, that was both shameful to them and to their husband, because the husband should be the one bringing home the bacon. The wife should be at home cooking it. So again, we're talking about very traditional households. So he's assuming, I presume you are a widow, which of course we actually legally can't ask today. And yet the assumption is too, I mean, it's the same thing with like school teachers. And you can actually read these rules, you can find them online, but they'd have school teachers rules for school teachers about what they could and couldn't do. They weren't allowed to date, and they weren't allowed to be married. Once they married, they were not going to be they would lose their job. And so she had to be really careful about, if she was going to get married, her husband better be able to support her, because an unmarried woman was the only one allowed to work. Now, a man could work and be married, but women were not in the same, that was, the rules were different. But a widow, people understood, because they obviously needed to, feed themselves and their children, so they had no choice. And so he asked you, do you have some experience in bookkeeping? And she says a fair amount. And he goes, well, I may be able to find something for you. And Nora's all happy. And Helmer says, this is what gets disturbing. You have just come at a fortunate moment, Mrs. Lynde. And he goes, and she says, how am I to thank you? And he goes, there's no need, but I must go. And Rank is going to go with him. And he says he'll be gone about an hour, and Christine's leaving too. And he says, oh, well, we can walk down the street together. And, Nora actually makes excuses like, sorry, we can't keep you here. Like, I can't give you a room to stay in because we're short of space. And she, of course, invites Mrs. Lynde to come for the evening festivities for Christmas, and reminds Dr. Rank too, remember, because he's invited. Now, of course, this is in Norway at Christmas time, so it is cold outside. And then we get to, we hear some children's voices off stage. Now, children were hard to put in a play, but they are in this one. In fact, there's a whole scene with them later. But Nora's like, there they are. So the nurse was off with them. Remember that she wasn't watching her own children. This is very typical of a, kind of upper middle class household, that she would have a nursemaid. She would have someone who would be essentially like the au pair or the governess or something of these children. And so she didn't really like parent all day the way that we do today. And then the kids come in. Let's see. That's, it's interesting. I remember that episode of MASH. But the truth is a lot of women, um, this is not unusual. In fact, there are a lot of people, even today, there are women who don't get promoted. They call it the glass ceiling. But they don't get promoted because there's always, lawyers and especially really high demand jobs. They don't get the promotion because the assumption is that, well, especially if they get married, the assumption is, well, they're going to want to settle down and have kids. And men, obviously, if they get married, the woman, their wives have kids, well, they still can work. But women, just even carrying a baby for 9 months, but then who's going to watch the baby? Very, very small infants really shouldn't be in daycare, and daycare is really expensive. And so, yeah, the even today, the majority of parenting falls on the woman, and so that affects work. Oh, if the woman, is missing, is absent a lot, or she calls in sick because her kids are sick, that, gives her a bad reputation. But, somebody has to watch the children. And yet it often falls, within female responsibility. And they're actually kind of going along with this. So but this is still something that there's still preconceived ideas that are definitely part of. Well, and it's funny because there are some countries where it is very typical for the state, for the country, to award men at least a month off of like paternal leave. And in some cultures, I know that there are several cultures, several different places in India where it's very standard for a woman to have a baby and the husband stays home for 2 months. And his job is to to do the dishes, cook the meals, do all of the stuff that the woman would normally do because she's supposed to take care of the baby. And so, I can't imagine, I cannot imagine having that much, freedom to have, my husband had to go back to, he was home for a week and then he had to go back to work. And I was only off for, so many weeks and then I had to go back to work. So, and if there are complications, you could end up out of work for longer, that kind of stuff happens. We do have laws that protect us, but at this time there would have been no such laws. Okay. So any laws about like what is it, FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, all that stuff where they save your job if you have to be out for a month or two or even a year. They could be required to hold your position open. And so that just didn't exist at this time. But she's a widow. She's already had her kids. She's not going to have more kids. So she's very hireable, actually. And so Helmer is very willing to consider that. So here come the kids. She kisses them. Oh, you sweet blessings. Look at them, Christine. Aren't they darlings? And Rank says, well, don't let us stand here in the draft. And then Helmer says, this is the dad, okay? Jordan just barely said baby has two parents after all. But look at what Torvald says. He says, come along, Mrs. Lynde. The place will only be bearable for a mother now. Like the fact that the kids are in the room makes him want to leave. Is that not the weirdest thing? I still remember that feeling weird. Now, I've known people who were not like, I don't know, great dads, really involved dads, but I don't know that I've ever met an actual person who did this, who was just like, oh my gosh, my own children are so annoying. I just can't bear to be in the same house when they're here. And I'm going to leave. And literally the kids would come home from school and he'd be like, nah, and leaving. So I'm sure that happens. I just, my dad wasn't like that. So she's all excited to see them. And then they're all talking at once. She's asking him questions. And she really seems to, she's kind of, she's willing to play a game. She goes, come, let's have a game. Hide and seek. Yes, we'll play hide and seek. So she's going to go play hide and seek with the kids. So for a woman at this time, upper class like this, she is a very involved woman. Okay. So the children laugh and shout and romp in and out of the room. And then Nora hides under the table and they don't find her. But then they hear her laughing, which I'm sure she's kind of doing on purpose so that they can find her. Because that's more fun than, Yeah, see, I think there are dads though that are very much well, and the extremely traditional household. I still remember the guidelines they'd give to women, because this is kind of a cultural snapshot too. I still remember the guidelines they'd give to women. I saw them posted from the 1950s, and it was, you know, make sure that your husband's slippers and cigar or pipe are ready for him when he gets home. Make sure the kids are already bathed and have already eaten so that he can pat them on the head and they can go to bed, so he doesn't have to deal with them. And it's such a there's such an assumption that the dads don't want to be around children, and so don't make the dads annoyed by having children in the living room with them. But the truth is, traditionally, children would be kept they wouldn't even eat with their parents in the upper class households. They would eat, it was always, how at Thanksgiving, when there's so many people get together, they have the kids' table and the adults' table. Well, the kids' table was in the nursery every day of the year. It wasn't just like for, holidays. They very rarely would eat at formal dinners. And so the dad might spend weeks hardly seeing them at all. Some of the moms didn't see them a whole lot. So, but it's not well like what we're used to. I had to, some moms and I exchanged, watching kids, but for the most part, my kids were with me, you know. And so I think that's just, I don't know, it's a lot different than it used to be. But as she's hiding, so she crawls forward, pretends to frighten them, and then there's a knock at the door, but she doesn't hear it. And then the door is half opened and Krogstad appears. So remember, he already left. We didn't see him go though. He talked to Torvald and then he left. And Krogstad comes in. Okay, so we already know Krogstad came in to talk to Torvald. We know that Nora knows him. We know that Christine knows him. We know that Torvald came back out, acted like there was nothing big, and that he said that Christine came at a timely moment and he might have a job for her. Okay, that's what he knows. That's what we know. But he comes in and she actually cries out. And she says, "What do you want?" And he says, "Excuse me, the outer door was ajar." And she says, "My husband is out, Mr. Krogstad." Okay, so this is a matter of manners and respectability. So if she's all by herself and her husband's not at home, no man should call on the house. No man should enter the house. It's not seemly. It's not respectable. And Krogstad says, "I know that." And Nora is kind of on the defensive. "Well, what do you want?" And he says, "I want to talk to you." And she says, "With me?" And she sends the kids to the nurse. And she goes, "What? No, the strange man won't do mother any harm. When he is gone, we will have another game." But she sends the kids away because this is a big, serious thing. And that actually tells us that it is by her actions. She's trying to act like nothing's big, but the fact that he even says, "What? No, the strange man won't do mother any harm," is a telling remark. He's a threat. And she says, "Okay, so you want to speak with me?" "Yes." And she goes, "It's not the first of the month yet." Why would she say that? What's due on the first of the month? January 1st. Right. She has to make her payment. She goes, "Why would you need to see me? It's not the first of the month." And he goes, "No, it's Christmas Eve. And it will depend on yourself what sort of a Christmas you will spend." And she goes, "What do you mean?" And she's like, "I can't pay you today." And he says, "We won't talk about that until later on. This is something different. I presume you can give me a moment." And it's a threat. This is threatening. And he goes, "I was in Olson's restaurant and I saw your husband leaving, essentially, with a lady." And Krogstad says, "Is that Mrs. Lind?" And she says, "Yes." And Krogstad said she just arrived in town. And she's a great friend of yours, isn't she? Yes. I knew her too, once upon a time. And Nora says she knows. She didn't know. Remember, Christine told her that she knew Krogstad before, back at the old town. And he says, oh, so you know all about it. Then I can ask you, is Mrs. Lynde to have an appointment at the bank? And she's like, why are you asking me that? You have no right. And she says, you, one of my husband's subordinates. But since you ask, you shall know. Yes, she's to have an appointment. And I pleaded her cause. And Krogstad said I was right in what I thought. And she says, sometimes one has a tiny little bit of influence, I should hope. That's herself. Because one is a woman, it does not necessarily follow that. But she's trying to say, look, just because I'm a woman, I do have some power and I can actually have some influence over my husband. Which is not the right thing to say, because she's kind of threatening. Yes, she did. She walked into it because she's kind of threatening Krogstad. Don't say anything unseemly to me because I have influence on my husband. And he's like, that's exactly what I need. I need your influence. I would like you to use your influence on my behalf. And again, she says, what do you mean? And he says, I need to keep my job. And she goes, well, who's going to take your job away? And he goes, don't pretend. Your friend is going to take my job. Christine Lynde is going to take my job away. And that's why you have to prevent that from happening. And she says, but I have no influence. Oh, I just thought you said you did. And she goes, how am I supposed to influence him to make you keep your job? And this is the problem. Okay, yes, she can influence him to hire Christine. Christine's a woman. If she starts talking to her husband about Krogstad, oh, you should let him keep his job. Her husband's going to be like, how do you even know that dude? And why would you argue with me about him? And so Krogstad knew her husband when they were students. But I don't think Torvald has any understanding that Krogstad and Nora really know each other. And certainly he has no knowledge of why. Right. That's any husband would. If I were to go in and say, oh, honey, this guy I met, you really need to give him a job. Why are you talking about some guy? It does look suspicious. And he ignores that. He's just desperate because he doesn't want to lose his job. And she says, if you speak slightingly of my husband, I will turn you out of the house. So they're kind of back and forth trying to do this. And Krogstad even tries to control himself. When he comes across as bossy, he is desperate. He says, listen to me. I am prepared to fight for my small post in the bank as if I were fighting for my life. Of course, the truth is, you can say, oh, well, he got fired. And you can take it, flippantly, which Nora kind of does. And Torvald certainly does about firing Krogstad. But the truth is he says the truth is, and he's trying to undo a wrong. And it's a wrong in his, remember that Dr. Rank called him morally corrupt, that he had moral failings. And he's admitting it himself. He goes, it's not only for the sake of the money. It is for the sake of the money. He does need the money for his children, to raise his kids. But what there is another reason. My position is this. Once, many years ago, I was guilty of an indiscretion. And Nora, of course, hadn't heard about that until today, but yeah. And if Torvald were to come in right now, this would be bad, with extra bad. Like I said, remember, he wasn't even supposed to come into the house if Torvald was not there. So talk about indiscretion. Anybody on the street could have seen him come up to the door and could have seen her husband walking down the street. And they had there were nosy neighbors back then too. So, but he says the matter never came into court, so he never got charged for it, but it was a crime. But every way seemed to be closed to me after that. So it was hard to get a job after he had done something he shouldn't have done. I had to do something, and it's not like I've done the worst crimes ever, but now I have to cut myself free from all of that. My sons are growing up. For their sake, I must try and win back as much respect as I can in the town. This post was the first step for him going out of this hole that he had dug for himself. And now your husband is going to kick me downstairs again into the mud. And Nora says, I can't help you. He says, then it's because you don't want to, but I can compel you to. And this is where we get to the crux of the tension. This is the conflict that we will follow all the way through. He is desperate. He really is desperate. And we have to understand that desperation. There's something, I mean, when there are things that we will do when we are desperate that we would never do otherwise. There are things that we would, I mean, I've known people who would dig trash out of a restaurant's trash can or dumpster so that they could find food. I've known people who would resort to stealing so that they could get what they needed or feed their families. Or that's exactly like it, Jordan. He's like an animal in a corner. Now Torvald sees things very black and white. Things are good or they're bad. It's actually a form of, it's a level of development called dualism. And most children are dualistic. They everything is right or wrong, black or white. It's just it's either good or it's bad. There's no middle, nothing's gray. And then they get into what they call, and this is during college actually, you get into a different phase called multiplicity, where you start saying, well, that thing works okay for them, but this works for me. You're more likely to change your mind about things. You're more likely to be influenced that, hey, at least, even if I don't agree with them, they're cool, that kind of thing. And then, but many of us never step out of dualism. In a way, I think you're right, that Torvald is childish. Yeah, nothing is neutral. Everything is charged, and it's all good or bad, good or bad. And so to him, if he finds out Krogstad did something naughty, well, Krogstad's just bad. And so she says, you don't mean that you will tell my husband I owe you money. In other words, I'm desperate, and I will use this if I have to make you do what I need you to do. And she says, you're going to tell him that I owe you money. And he goes, what if I did tell him? And she starts to sob. It would put me in a horribly disagreeable position. That's an understatement. And he says only disagreeable because right now he's facing poverty. This is his leg out, and he's about to be kicked out by Torvald because of past indiscretions. And he's like, okay, it's a little unhappy. The word disagreeable is not very charged. And she's like, well, okay, fine, do it. And it will be the worst for you. My husband will see for himself what a blackguard you are. Of course, it will also mean that he'll see you. And then she says, of course, if my husband knows, he'll pay what's still left to owe. And then he says, either you have a very bad memory or you know very little of business. I shall be obliged to remind you of a few details. And this is where we get to the crux of why it's a problem. It's not just that she's in debt. He says, you came to me to borrow 250 pounds. I promised to get you that amount on certain conditions. I promised to get the money on the security of a bond which I drew up, which I signed, but below your signature, There were a few lines constituting your father a surety for the money. Remember, women cannot borrow money on their own. So she had to have her dad co-sign or her husband co-sign. Well, her husband was really sick and she didn't want him to know that she was taking out a loan. And he says, I had left the date blank. Your father should himself have inserted the date on which he signed the paper. And she goes, I remember. He says, then I gave you the bond and sent it for you to mail to your dad. And you did it because 5 or 6 days afterwards, you brought me the bond with your father's signature. And I gave you the money. And she goes, and I've been paying it off. She goes, yes, but your father was very ill, wasn't he? Yeah. And he died soon afterwards. And Nora says, yes. Can you remember what day your father died? And she says, the 29th of September. So she remembers the day. And he goes, exactly. And that is the problem. There is a discrepancy on the form, which I cannot account for. The fact is that her father signed this bond 3 days after he had died. Your father died on the 29th of September, but his signature is dated on the 2nd of October. So what happened? What did she do? He says, was this your father's signature? Did he sign it? And the answer is no, he didn't. She signed it. It was I that wrote Papa's name. And she admits it to Krogstad. You know what that means? She's committed forgery. And forgery is bad, 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 bad. This is like felony level, especially given how much she borrowed. She could be charged with a felony for this. Now, this is in our country, but at that time, I mean, and given the amount that she borrowed, remember, this was a year's vacation to Italy. That's a lot of money to forge a signature for. And it would be so easy to prove because his bond that he could show anybody. His bond is dated 3 days after we know her father was dead. And she says, I couldn't get him to sign. He was so ill. Oh, she would have been in jail, at least. And she would have spent many, many years in jail. And it would have looked horrible too. Remember, okay, where's her husband? Who does he work for? He's the manager of a bank. And his wife ends up in jail for forgery. Guess who doesn't stay manager of a bank? It would affect his reputation as well. So this is bad. This is so absolutely horrible for her. This is a scary place to be. It would affect her husband's job. It would affect her. It could put her in jail. Obviously, if her husband lost his job, he would be in somewhat the same place that Krogstad is right now. Who would hire him? Everything, yes, everything that they had known, this world, this little, this house, this marriage, everything would fall apart. And he says, Krogstad said it would have been better for you if you'd given up your trip abroad. And she's like, look, this was not a vacation. The trip was to save my husband's life. I couldn't give that up. And he says, did it never occur to you that you were committing a fraud on me? And she says, I couldn't not do it. I could, and this is where I talked about multiplicity, this idea of gray areas. So what would you do? Are there things that, laws you would break to save your husband or your child or your whole family? Are there things that you would do to cover up something to save your reputation? Well, yeah. I mean, Krogstad would, and he'd love to kind of erase his past. But at the same time, anybody would, Nora doesn't want anybody to know about this. She hasn't even told her husband what she did after years. And she asks him, it's kind of like what is that? It's one of those morality tests, where they're looking at relative morality, situational morality. She says, do you ask me to believe that you were brave enough to run a risk to save your wife's life? And so he says, I can assure you that my one false step that I'm being judged for, which has lost me all my reputation, was nothing more or nothing worse than what you have done right now, what you have done to me, and what you have done forging a signature. And she goes, are you saying that you were doing that to run a risk to save a wife's life? And he says, the law cares nothing about motives. Right. Well, and the truth is, do we have, I mean, okay, so if you guys have ever seen Les Miserables, I don't like the movie, but I love the play and I love the book. The book is fantastic, very much worth reading. Jean Valjean ends up in jail for 19 years, but he got 5 years for stealing a loaf of bread. He broke a window in a storefront and he stole a loaf of bread through the window. He got 5 years for that. And all the rest of the 14 other years that he spent in jail, yes, Anne Hathaway is the best part of that movie. But the 14 years he spent in jail happened because he kept trying to escape, and they'd tack on more years to his sentence. And so for stealing a loaf of bread, essentially, he ended up in prison for almost 20 years. And so most of us can say that's really ridiculous. That's uncalled for. And so we have instant sympathy for him, but the laws themselves are the laws. And they, we used to have the 3 strikes law. So if someone were caught with marijuana 3 times, they'd end up in jail forever. They'd have a life sentence. That's what the 3 strikes and you're out law did. Now, most of those are being rescinded. But the assumption was if you're going to keep doing the same thing over and over again, you're just going to go to jail forever, In this case, he's saying the law is firm and it is the law by which you will be judged. So I can actually produce this and make this public, and then you're going to end up in jail. And she's like, okay, look, I didn't get my father's signature because he was dying. I didn't get my husband's signature because he was dying. I had to save his life. And she says, you must be a very poor lawyer, Mr. Krogstad. And the truth is she can go in there and she's going to, some jurors may go, wow, she was in a terrible position, but she still broke the law. And she's taking a huge chance if she allows him to reveal the secret. And he says, matters of business, such business as you and I have had together, do you think I don't understand all of that? Very well. Do as you please, but let me tell you this. If I lose my position a second time, you shall lose yours with me. In other words, if I get fired, this is going to become public. And he leaves. Huge threat to everything that she, all of her life, everything. To her marriage, to her husband's job, to her children, to herself. It's a huge threat. And she goes, no, it's impossible. I did it for love's sake. Let me see what you're saying, Jordan. The fact that Krogstad. No, and I think that's a really important thing. And it goes with, Les Mis, for instance, when he's being helped by the priest, he steals from the priest out of, just feeling desperation because no one else had ever given him any mercy at all. But the priest, he was about to go back to jail for goodness knows how many years for stealing all of the priest's like candlesticks and silver. And the priest says, no, I gave those to him. He lied to protect the man, to protect Jean Valjean and keep him from going back to jail. But the truth is until that step happens, Jean Valjean is desperate. And that hasn't happened. Nobody has shown Krogstad any mercy at all. And that's a real problem. And so, yeah, he's desperate and he's willing to lash out in ways and do things that honestly, if he were to be able to sit down, if he were in a place of comfort, he would never do. We think he's just a creep at this point. We don't understand until things change because we have several characters in this that are dynamic. They don't stay the same. They're not static characters. They actually change as the play continues. And that's really important. So we're going to see some people grow a bit, and then we're going to see people who don't grow, and that's important as well. So then the children come back in, but she's a different mom than she was at the beginning of when they first came in. Remember, she was all cool and let's play hide and seek and stuff like that. And she says, don't tell anyone about the stranger man, not even Papa. And she goes, will you come and play again? The kids are like, okay, but will you come and play again? She says, no, no, not now. And the children say, but Mother, you promised us. Yes, but I can't now. Run away in. I have such a lot to do. Run away in, my sweet little darlings. And she sends them away because she's not supposed to be around them, because she's taking, in some ways, judging herself the way Torvald would. And he's going to be very explicit later on in the next two acts about what, you know, if a parent is corrupt, what his or her children will end up like. And that's going to have an effect on her too. And she's like, no, 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 everything's fine. She actually starts decorating the tree after she sends the kids away. And here comes Torvald back. And remember, he said he was going to be gone an hour. He's probably been gone, 8 minutes, you know, but it's supposed to have been an hour. So that's the way that these things go. And then Helmer says, Torvald actually asks her, has anyone been here? And she goes, no. And he goes, well, I just saw Krogstad going out of the gate. Oh, yeah, he was here for a moment. And he says, I can see from your manner that he has been here begging you to say a good word for him. And Nora says, yes. And you were to appear to do it of your own accord? You were to conceal from me the fact of his having been here. Did he beg that of you too? And she admits, she says, yes, Torvald, but, and he goes, and you do that? To have any talk with a man like that, and give him any sort of promise, and to tell me a lie into the bargain. And she goes, a lie? Didn't you tell me no one had been here? And then he goes back to those my little songbird must never do that again. Ugh. It's the term for this is patronizing. My widow songbird. Talking baby talk, might as well do that. A songbird must have a clean beak to chirp with, no false notes. Oh, it's just, it's repugnant. I really hate this part. And so he says, we will say no more about it. So in other words, she can't actually talk about Krogstad at all, because he's already nipped all of that in the bud, and now she's doomed. And so she says, well, I tries to change the subject. I'm really looking forward to the fancy dress ball the day after tomorrow, so the day after Christmas. And he says, I'm tremendously curious to see what you're going to surprise me with, and what she's going to wear and what she's going to do. And so she goes, I can't think of anything at this point. It all seems silly and significant. And he says, does my little Nora acknowledge that at last, that what some of the stuff she likes is silly and insignificant? And so she asks Helmer, are you busy? Wants to see his papers. And I've got authority from the retiring manager to undertake the necessary changes in staff. And I must make use of the Christmas week for that, so that everything's in order for the new year. And she said, then that was why this poor Krogstad, she uses the word poor, and Helmer goes, don't like that. And she says, couldn't you help me decide what sort of dress I shall wear? Like she's trying to distract him essentially from the bank stuff. Because in the bank stuff, what's going to happen? Krogstad's going to get fired. So the thing he says, if it happens, I'm going to tell everybody, well, yeah, it was nice of the priest. Actually, in the book, Jordan, I don't want to ruin the book, but it's so good. In the book, the priest gives away the silver to Jean Valjean, and then he goes to his bed and he dies in his sleep that night. So it's honestly, it's one of those books I have literally, oh good, I'm glad I'm not the only one who thinks it's icky. Les Miserables is one of those books that everyone should read. Read the abridged version. Don't read I read one, my abridged version was 1,200 pages, but it made me cry so many times. It took me a whole summer to read. I was 11th grader, and I cried and cried and cried and cried and cried and cried. I cried so many times in a single book. But it was amazing. It's such a great book. So anyway, essentially, she asks about Krogstad, and I know we're going over just a couple minutes, but I wanted to kind of try to get through this part. But she asks, what was Krogstad guilty of? And I'm going to leave it right at this point, because he says he forged someone's name. And he says, have you any idea what that means? And she says, isn't it possible he was driven to do so by necessity? And okay. She goes, he says, many a man has been able to retrieve his character if he has openly confessed his fault and taken his punishment. But Krogstad didn't. Remember, he said it never went to court. He got himself out of it by a cunning trick, and that's why he's gone under altogether. So he sees him as morally corrupt because he hasn't been punished for forgery, exactly the same thing she's just done. So we're going to leave it at that. So, because Helmer absolutely judges him, and Nora takes that judgment upon herself because she's done the same thing. And this is where we're going to get to the ugliness, but we just have no more time. Do you guys have any questions? You guys were so good in chat. Oh my gosh. There's so much good stuff in here. If you have any questions, you can put them in, or you can turn on your mic and ask me really quick. Let's see. Well, the truth is, and this is what's so weird. Okay, it's kind of like, I like that point, Jordan. Yeah, what Krogstad's already been through, losing his other job, not being able to get more jobs, living in poverty. He's been punished. But you think about like laws, a lot of states have put in laws about parents who accidentally leave their babies in their car and the baby dies, which is the most horrifying thing I could ever have imagined when I was a new mother. I was deathly afraid of doing something just like that. But it happens. People get distracted, something happens, they get out of their routine, whatever it is, and the baby ends up in the car and dies of the heat or whatever. And they've instituted, some states have death row type stuff, or they're going to be in jail forever, to punish the parents. The truth is, the parents are so punished already because there's nothing in the world that is worse than losing a child. Nothing. And to know it's your fault, it would be absolutely horrifying. And honestly, you could put me in jail for the rest of my life and it wouldn't make much difference to me because I already would be tortured for the rest of my life because of what I'd done. Even if it was accidental, knowing that I'd caused the death of someone who was so dear to me, I would never get over that. So, adding again, I think at first though, this first scene, especially this first act, we don't have a lot of sympathy for Krogstad, but the more that Krogstad and Nora are placed side by side, and we understand the reasons why Nora has done what she's done and the desperation that she feels, it helps her understand and us understand why Krogstad may have done what he's done and why he's threatening her. So he's both the villain and we have sympathy for him. And so in the end, I'm probably on the last day, I'm going to add, and you can even answer me even by email, once you've read the whole play and everything. Who's the worst person in the play? It's not Krogstad. Who's the person people are overwhelmingly going to like the least? Not him. Yeah, see, I'm kind of in there. Right. Yeah, see, Brooke said it publicly. But I think most of us agree. And it's not because, do you ever do anything wrong or not? It's not that kind of moral upstanding. It's how much do you judge other people? And how much do you see yourself as superior to other people? And most of us don't gravitate to that. We don't like it when somebody places themselves above others. And he does. He does all the time. And honestly, he could use a bit of humility. He really could. He would be a better person. So we'll see. Maybe he never wrote like a Doll's House 2, so we never found out what happened to Torvald. That would be a really interesting play. You know, Torvald has to grow a bit and you know, figure things out and raise his children. Anyway, okay, that's enough for now. If you do have any questions, though, please feel free to talk to me. I'm going to stop the recording, though.